So hi everybody, welcome to Chawton House Online. My name is Kim Simpson and I'm the Deputy Director here. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. The price of your ticket has provided us with much needed support towards our 20th anniversary campaign, which some of you will have seen. So thank you very much for donating generously. And I'm super excited. So tonight marks the first event of the digital program connected to our new exhibition, Quills and Characters. So this is an exhibition that I've curated. I've been thinking about it for a while, and it explores the art of letter writing in the 18th and 19th century. And it tells some of the stories of some of the extraordinary women in our collection that you might not know through their letters. So there are several kind of digital events to come, online tours, specialist talks, a study day and a conference. And these are all drawn together by this interest in letters. So letters as material objects. It asks questions about the kind of practicalities of sourcing materials for letters, sending letters. And then it also thinks about letters as the containers of stories that in this exhibition, at least, do something to challenge our preconceived notions about women's lives and their interests. So I won't say too much more about the exhibition here, but for those of you who can't make it to Chawton House in person, I'll be doing an online curators tour of this on the 7th of May. So come along if you're interested in how to cut quill pens or how to warn your friends off frothy French lovers, or who has the worst handwriting but the best wax seals of the 19th century. So over to our event tonight. We're welcoming the fabulous Devoney Looser. Devoney is Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University, and she is the author of a fantastic double biography of our subjects this evening, the Porter Sisters, sister novelists, the Trailblazing Porter Sisters, who paved the way for Austen and the Brontës. Devoney is also the author or editor of 9 other books on literature by women, including The Making of Jane Austen, which I'm sure many of you will have read. And her writings appeared very broadly in The Atlantic, the New York Times, the TLS, Washington Post. She's talked about Austen on CNN and in a series of video and audio lectures for the great courses as well. She also has played roller derby with the excellent name Stone Cold Jane Austen, and is a Guggenheim Fellow and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. Devoney, thank you so much for being here. So I think you're going to start off by reading the opening pages of the biography, which will set the scene for this work and set the scene for our conversation, which is going to sort of think a little bit about the work you do as a biographer with letters, and then think about the lives of these two extraordinary women who've kind of fallen off the map somewhat in the years since they existed.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for this lovely opportunity, for that great introduction. And it just so thrilling to see friendly faces, new faces of faces I've known for a while, and people I've known through Jasno or through Jane Austen Society in the UK. Just means so much to be here. And so, yes, Kim's asked me to start by reading. It's about, what did we say, Kim? 4 or 5 minutes. It's just a few minutes, the first couple of pages of the book, which I'm excited to do and start us off. So it's from the prologue, which is titled Two Sisters of Blazing Genius. I was sitting in the reading room at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, during the summer of 2004. Any scholar fortunate enough to have worked at its pristine desks knows it's a beautifully silent place, save for the low-grade clacking of fingers on keyboards and the occasional clearing of a throat. In front of me, there was a folder, number 839 out of 2,662, from the Jane Porter papers. It contained a long letter written in a sharp, half-curvy hand, dated July 15th, 1820. It began, "Dearest Jane," and was signed, "Your Mariah." As I read, I found myself needing to stifle laughter. The letter's pages were filled with delightfully snarky gossip. One sister was writing to another about how she'd escaped alive from a boring, gluttonous dinner party hosted by neighbors. So much food was served that, as Mariah put it, I was literally crammed with as many different things as there were animals in the ark. Mariah decided to approach the meal like a soldier heading into battle, circumventing the meat in favor of a sophisticated attack on fine fruit. The other guests were described with unsparing mockery. One man, she joked, must have fallen desperately in love with me as he sat gazing either with horror or admiration at me all the time he was playing whist. Another man, choosing conversation over card games, went off like an alarm at particular words. The scene was ridiculous, Mariah confessed. I longed for Miss Austen's now buried pen, alas that it is, to have immortalized the whole company. What struck me as I read Mariah's words was that this letter could go head to head with any of the 160 or thereabouts that survived from Jane Austen. The sarcasm was dripping, the comic timing was impeccable, and the implicit social criticism was pointed. With a light touch, Mariah deftly eviscerated the meal, the silly human alarm man, and the inscrutably staring bore. No doubt he was gawking at her because she was an authoress, as celebrated women writers were called. At the time, Mariah Porter was far more famous than Miss Austen, who died just 3 years before and wasn't yet a household name. I was savoring every detail in Mariah's letter when I was jolted back to the present. The walkie-talkie sitting on the desk in front of me buzzed. For a split second, I couldn't remember what year it was. Okay, I couldn't remember what century it was. This kind of cognitive lapse may be hard to imagine for some, but for those of us who spend countless hours in libraries reading unpublished letters by long dead people, our work is a kind of time-traveling excavation of lost stories. It sometimes proves difficult to dig yourself out. The walkie-talkie's buzzing required my attention. It was a signal from my husband, asking me to meet him outside the library because our infant son was crying from hunger. The buzz was noisy proof that I lived in the 21st century, that it was time to nurse our baby, and that the labor of a man was making possible my archival work on the history of 19th century women. I could imagine what some of the writers I study might have had to say about my priorities and this unusual role reversal. To women writers then, including the sisters whose vast correspondence I was reading, how wondrously jumbled and impossible to pull off would my identities as scholar, professor, writer, wife, and mother likely have seemed. The risks that Jane and Mariah Porter took to publish, obstacles faced, criticisms endured, had absolutely paved the way for me and other scholars to recover their life stories. Reading their correspondence sometimes felt like voyeurism. It also felt like repaying a debt. All right, and that's as much as Kim and I decided we'd start with there, but thank you for listening to that.
Thank you so much for that really kind of vivid introduction to, I suppose, your introduction to the Porter sisters. I wonder if you could say a bit. I mean, you're clearly drawn to them because of the liveliness of their letters, but were there other things as well? Because this is just the beginning of the story, right? How did it kind of develop after that? How did your relationship with the Porter sisters develop, and why did you make the decision to spend these years writing their biography?
Yes, I could answer that in a long way, but I'll try to use a pithier way. When I first started reading in Jane Porter's materials, it was looking at her old age, because I was working on a book on British women writers and old age. And there are lots of things about her old age that are fascinating. But there were these thousands of letters. And so I started dipping into these other letters. And especially, it turned out there were lots of letters between these two sisters. And I started just to find them gripping. And at first I thought I would just write a short book talking about how their lives were really prefigured a lot of parts of Jane Austen's novels plots, that, you know, they were proof that the kinds of things that Austen was writing about were certainly in the realm of the realistic or the real. but also the way I put it in the book itself is that they were like funhouse mirror versions of Jane Austen's plots, like Jane Austen's plots gone kind of awry. And, I really thought that was where I was going to start, not with a biography. But after that, I thought, these women really deserve a biography. Someone should write a biography. And then there was a point where I realized probably I could be that somebody. Maybe I should be that somebody. And from there, the project took off.
Mm-hmm. So you then spent a lot of time kind of tracking down their letters. But I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask was, why are they important? It's what can they kind of offer to a modern audience, and also what do they tell us? What does their reputation tell us about literary fame, particularly for women writers?
Yes. And there are a couple of prongs to answering this great question too, Kim. I think one has to do with the historical novel. And the argument of the biography is that the sisters were important innovators in what we think of as the modern version of the historical novel. And I could say more about that, but they predated Scott, although Scott later got all the credit. And so one of the stories of the book is to say there were these two important sister innovators before Scott who were doing things with history and fiction in ways that were important, in ways that were best-selling before Scott, and in ways that we've really lost sight of that deserves to be recovered. I think there are some ways, however, in which their letters might be a greater contribution to literature than even these novels, or at least the letters to me have stood the test of time perhaps better than the novels. And I can say more about that if we want to go in that direction. But these letters that survive, I mentioned the 2,600 at the Huntington Library in the introduction, but in fact, there are probably something near 7,000 items in Porter family collections, that most of which were exported to the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And so they are at the New York Public Library, the University of Kansas Spencer Library, and the Huntington Library. Thousands. I mean, for Jane Austen, we have those 160, and for the Porter Sisters, we have these thousands. But many hundreds of them are brilliant and funny and tell us so much about the world at the time, as well as the incredibly interesting circles the sisters were involved in. So I think there's a historical fiction part. I think there's the letters part. There's also the professional women writers part. The sisters talk, as you mentioned, about fame. They also talk about financial struggles with publishers, things that just really illuminate for us a lot of things that we've become very interested in Jane Austen's life and career, but don't really have the same kind of first-person data to draw on that we do with the Porters.
Yeah, and I think I suppose the other thing that really struck me when I was reading biography is the relationship between the two sisters as well, and a kind of document of this very, very close family relationship, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your kind of approach to all of this really unruly material. It being sort of spread across all of these different libraries, and there being so much of it as well. So how on earth did you go about tackling this? Did you read all of them or some of them, or?
When I first started reading them, I didn't know I was writing a biography, right? So it would be nice if I started reading them knowing that. I would have tackled the material differently and maybe more systematically. At first, I was just kind of reading around because it was interesting. I really wish I could have read all of the letters that I read for the first time the second time, right? Like knowing. But I did try to lay my eyes on everything. And there are materials I didn't look at in South America. I don't have Russian language skills, and there turns out to be a really interesting Russian connection. So I know there are things that I missed in other languages. And, I certainly used materials that are in the UK. There's a great collection of a couple of hundred pieces at the University of Durham, and the Porters had connections to Durham. I did work at the Surrey History Center. There was a really helpful librarian, curator, archivist there, Julian Pooley, a scholar who was very helpful there. So, and of course, the British Library has some materials. I really, fortunately, thanks to those fellowships you named, Kim, got to travel to a lot of places and read these items. The number of words of notes I have for this project is embarrassing, like embarrassing, like Samuel Richardson's Clarissa level embarrassing.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So yeah, it's quite a lot of sifting through to kind of pull together a narrative, I suppose. And of course, yeah, there is that issue of when you first start reading letters, you don't really know the characters, and then you slowly kind of get to know them as you're reading them, and you slowly kind of come to understand what's going on in the lives as well. I mean, did you use other sources as well? What were the kind of raw materials, or was it just the letters between Maria and Jane?
Well, obviously, absolutely, I had to draw on other sources. I mean, there are, it isn't, all of the knowledge I had from Jane Austen studies really was very useful. And I drew a lot on important critics and scholars who have described for us the way that transportation and households and servants and spinsters, and I mean, I could name lots of critics whose work definitely informed this biography, and for which I'm grateful. Social history, literary history. Absolutely, this couldn't have been done without the project British Fiction 1800 to 1829, which really allowed me to understand a given year in literary history and what exactly was published and how is it reviewed. And so, yes, absolutely, these other kinds of things were central to the writing of the book. However, what I did, and I do say this in the introduction of the book, I chose to center the sisters' letters and the sisters' stories in the telling of their lives. So this is a literary biography, and that it mentions their books and it gives you short descriptions and summaries of their books. It tells you about how the books were received and how much money, when it's known, each work made. And the sisters published 26 books separately and together. But I would say those details are told within the context of what I find to be really vivid and colorful stories about the sisters' personal and professional lives, and also their love lives. Their love lives were very polite. I believe they were chaste, but their love lives were not boring. Their love lives were actually quite exciting and dramatic and heartbreaking. And I wanted that part to be clear, that two unmarried sisters had full, rich, interesting love lives, despite everything we're told or have been traditionally told to the contrary about women of that, a middle class education and that unmarried status in this period of time. It was a lot more complicated, and the sisters' lives show that.
Yeah, no, I think there's a real sense of the excitement of being out and being at balls and meeting people, and that really kind of came to life. I think before we kind of talk about their lives, I just wanted to kind of ask one more question about some of the issues around letters. I mean, one of the things that I think about in the exhibition is this tension between the idea that letters give us an insight into the kind of true character of the writer versus the fact that letters are often, coded in particular ways, or performances. They're written to be read aloud. So I wondered about the kind of the issues around that, and kind of the truth of letters, I suppose, but also the kind of ethical issues as well around letters. You talked in that opening bit about sort of feeling like a voyeur, and I wonder whether you have thoughts on that, having kind of published some of them. What would the sisters have made of that?
These are both great, difficult questions. Maybe just to start with the ethical one. There is a section in Jane Porter's papers where she talks about wanting the papers to go to a future possible biographer, and she names a few friends. And so she, at the end of her life, definitely went over, wrote notes on, and curated some of these papers. She also has a line where she told her brother that as far as she's concerned, she never wanted her sister. Maria died first, plot spoiler. Both sisters died, big plot spoiler, right? Biography, plot spoiler. She wanted Maria's letters never to be published, but she said, if it were up to me, I would preserve them forever. And she didn't. Although she lived decades after Maria, she kept these letters. She organized them. She sorted them. So yes, she didn't want them to be published, but she had every opportunity to destroy them and couldn't bring herself to do so. So is there something unethical about publishing these letters, she asked not to be published. Well, I've published material from the letters, right? To some people, yes, I can see that. For me, I think my feeling was they lived in the public eye, they saved their materials, and they loved each other. And you can't know what someone would think 200 years on. There are no heirs. I think their stories, to my mind, are important and deserve to be told. And to me, that is the larger ethical consideration over what a woman in 1850 thought then, when she was concerned about what the people around her might say or know. But this is thorny, and I know not every biographer would have made the same choice. In fact, sometimes, and maybe you run across this, Kim, in the classroom too, sometimes there will be people who in a Jane Austen class will say, oh, Jane Austen didn't want her letters to be published. I don't think we should read these. And, I don't have that feeling about Jane Austen's letters. I'm guessing most of us have read the letters and probably don't have that same sense. In her case, it was a family member who chose to bring them out first. But these are thorny, difficult questions. I didn't have a lot of quandaries about bringing this story forward, in part because they've been so long dead, and because I think it's a beautiful story.
I mean, I think with Austen as well, her letters are already kind of curated by Cassandra, burning so many of them. Whereas you get the sense with the Porter sisters that actually it's all kind of, I mean, I don't know whether there are kind of gaps in the archive, but you do get the sense that it's a much kind of fuller picture of what was going on in their actual lives. So it seems like more of a kind of insight.
Right. And you asked about letters and truth. Can I jump back to that? Because that's so important. I mean, of course, anytime you are writing a letter, you are thinking of your audience and you're telling something in a certain way. It's, it's slanted. It's couched in a particular way. I guess I have chosen to see the family's confessions to each other as more true, or at least as true enough to give a family story within, and in large part because the family lied outrageously in its public writings about itself. And they would say in their letters, like, we've just lied in this thing that we put out, and lie is a strong word. They mythologized their own lives. They would claim to be from a higher social status than they were. They put a sheen on some of the stories about their background to make it seem more genteel. The letters tell a different story. So can the letters be trusted as 100% truthful? No, I don't think any letter can. I think the places where they're describing their emotions, where they're describing their interactions with each other, it's as true to themselves and they're speaking to each other as probably we're going to get from any dead person. So in that sense, I trust many parts of this letter as emotionally true and interesting documents. And I do consider this a work of nonfiction.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's also, though, if you're writing a letter, you're not always sure how you feel about a particular thing. And I think that came across really clearly with Jane, who's trying very hard to kind of be emotionally honest in a society and in a way that it just isn't encouraged or inculcated in people at the time at all. So I think there's that thing about, how much people know themselves when they're writing these things too, which kind of came across to me while I was reading.
Yes.
I suppose we should talk a bit about their lives now, having talked about the letters and the kind of the access point to their lives. So maybe we should start off with their childhood. Could you say a bit about the sort of childhood and the education that they had, and the sort of social class that they were brought up in? What kind of politics did they have, for example?
Yes. So Jane and Anna Maria, like Jane Austen, were born in the 1770s, but they were born in the north of England. And their father was an Irish-born army surgeon, and their mother was the daughter of a Durham innkeeper. And they were engaged for a long time because they didn't have money to marry. He was a younger son. He wasn't doing terribly well as an army surgeon, but they ended up marrying in 1770. They started having children. And then the thing that happened to the Porter family that the Austens didn't experience until much later is that William Porter, the army surgeon, died. And when he died, he left his widow, whose name was also named Jane Porter, let's call her Mrs. Porter, for this conversation. He left Mrs. Porter with 5 children under the age of 8. And with very little money, she was quickly in debt. And so she ended up doing the line of work that she knew from her childhood and teenage years. She ended up running boarding houses. And it was a very difficult youth. I think especially the 3 younger children, she kept close by her. The 2 older ones, she managed to finagle apprenticeships for. But the 3 younger, she kept close by her, and they were no doubt helping her run this boarding house. But she also gave them incredible freedom to read. And they had one short stint in Edinburgh charity school. And that is how they ended up knowing Sir Walter Scott as children, which is just so amazingly coincidental and bizarre that as children, these, 3 of the most famous writers of this generation knew each other. The Porter sisters were in a charity school. Sir Walter Scott, Walter Scott as he then was, right, was in Tony High School, but they were in the same kinds of Edinburgh circles, which is just fascinating to me. From there, the Porters went back to Durham, a little short stint in Ireland, and then from there to London, where Brother Robert enrolled in the Royal Academy schools. He became a famous artist. So incredible family, incredible talent. They started out middle class. They wrote, they fell below it, and then tried to basically climb their way back through into achievements through arts, letters, and their fame.
Great. And it seemed like they grew up in an environment that really kind of encouraged their creativity and their genius as well. And I don't know whether that came from Mrs. Porter or whether it came from the kind of relationships that they had with one another. Could you say a bit about what Jane and Maria were like, what their personalities were like, and what kind of relationship they had with each other and with their other siblings as well?
Right. So I think we would look at them, and they were opposites and very, very close, beloved to each other, very close, but opposites. I think Janeites would look at them and say, oh, this looks a lot like Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. Jane was the older, she was also taller and darker hair, but strong, authoritative, rational, reasonable. She was certainly very feeling, but she came off more shy, quiet, and possessed. Whereas Maria, the younger sister, who had more fair hair, was very much more outgoing, wore her heart on her sleeve, enthusiastic, said to love everyone and everything, seems more like a Marianne Dashwood. So I think when we imagine them today, we might have those comparisons in mind. In the day, their nicknames were L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, and these are from the Milton poems. So there were this Miltonic comparison of the more lively man and the more melancholy man that was used to describe these 2 sisters. So they had the personalities really come through in their letters, and if I've captured that in the book, I feel really grateful because they deserve that. They deserve that. They could make their voices on the page just come alive for me, and I hope I brought some of that to the book.
No, you definitely have. I mean, I've only seen letters by Jane, actually, and we have a couple of Jane's letters, but I would really like to see Maria's as well, because I think that those sort of differences would be apparent. But how did they come to publish, and what kind of, they're very different, they're markedly different in their personalities, but what about their kind of writing practices as well?
Yes, so, and this is where it's a little more like the Brontës, although I think there's some similarities to the young Austens too. The sisters started writing as girls, and they were really encouraged to write in this charity school in Edinburgh, but they seem to have enjoyed making up nicknames and make-believe worlds in the way that the Brontës did, and sharing writings with each other that were really fantastical and just fun-loving. There's one letter where Maria says, as I am your queen, you must obey me. They were just having fun with each other in words, and calling, Arethusa and Adalia, and making romantic nicknames up for each other, and just entire fictional worlds that they seemed to some degree to be living in. But there was a period when their move to London happened where they were clearly falling more deeply into debt, or at least difficulties. And at that point, the decision was made to take Mariah's, so the younger sister's stories, and to publish them in a book by subscription under her own name. So her first book was published in 1793 at the age of 14, which is just remarkable. There were a few other young women publishing during this period, but of course, I can't help but think that Jane Austen would have been looking on and seeing these girls who were about her age publishing these books, because Mariah went on to publish a couple of more too. And they made some money. I think they probably allowed the family to live for about 6 months, modestly, from what they made. The subscription list is incredible and includes high flyers from the art world, high flyers from the political world and the progressive and abolitionist world. They were really tied into some interesting circles in London, as well as their brothers in the West Indies who were working for people who were making money off of enslaved people's labors. So that it was a difficult, interesting subscribers list. But the critics and the reviews were cruel, absolutely cruel. Didn't matter to them that it was a 14-year-old girl. They were going to, cut her off at the kneecaps. In fact, they basically told the sisters repeatedly in the 1790s, stop publishing your novels, kind of like go home, be nice girls, grow into polite, chaste, lovely women, and, stop reading, but definitely stop publishing. And I think it's remarkable that probably for financial reasons, but also they had the wherewithal to ignore that advice.
You think of Southey writing to Charlotte Brontë, literature is not the business of a woman's life. But for financial reasons, possibly, they carried on, right? So you talked about Mariah publishing at 14, but what sort of novels did they publish?
So early on, they were publishing short stories. They were definitely inspired by Shakespeare, was Anna Mariah's favorite author. Sir Philip Sidney was Jane's favorite author. They were definitely inspired by romances, plays, and they were also reading lots of interesting novels from the period. So Jane started publishing in Gothic fiction, for instance. They knew famous writers. They were hanging out with Mary Robinson, and there's a whole chapter on that, which is a crushing and interesting connection that they made to Mary Robinson, the famous early feminist poet, novelist, everything you can say about Robinson. I know that she's well known to Chawton House community. Maybe not so well as she should be known among Janeites, but I think these kinds of connections got them interested in the novel. And it was in 1803 that Jane made her first pivot to a work of historical fiction. And I could talk more about how I think she got there, but that work was called Thaddeus of Warsaw. It became a bestseller, and she found herself a household name. She found herself the talk of the town. Both sisters had published sometimes under their own name, sometimes anonymously, but they made the decision to publish Thaddeus of Warsaw under Jane's name. And she suddenly leapt above her sister in terms of her celebrity and sister novelists. I think at that point, from there to the ends of their lives, they were basically household names.
What were the kind of factors behind the decision to publish under their own names? Because I think there's a kind of prevailing myth that women always published anonymously, or they always published as by a lady, and of course that's not the case. But there are certain dangers associated with publishing under your own names. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, and the statistics that James Raven and his team have collected, and the Garside and Mandel team have collected, suggest that about 60% of novels in this period carried some form of anonymity. So that's a slight, majority of novels published, but it's not everything. So I think you're right. We absolutely assume, the women were all publishing anonymously, and it not true. Half of the novels at this period appear to have been by people who were publishing as female, half by people publishing as male, and then there's some fallout in there between anonymous and claimed or named. We're still trying to figure out, obviously, how all of these things shake out, but those are some rough pieces of data that are really interesting. So it wasn't weird that the Porter sisters would publish under their own name. It was definitely done for women in this period, but I think they made choices to do so when they thought it would be to their advantage. For instance, when publishing by subscription, it was easier to get subscribers to sign on for a known person, a known commodity, I think. But also in Jane Porter's case, there was one moment where she agreed to put her name on because she was sort of badgered into it by a publisher. And interestingly, that publisher was Crosby, the same one who bought Susan for 10 pounds and then never brought it out for Jane Austen. He made a house call to Jane Porter. And I tell this story in the biography. He made a house call to her and said, "You are going to cost me money if you don't put your name on this book. So please, will you put your name on the book?" And she agreed to put her name, her initial on the cover, but to have him name her as Miss Porter in the advertisements. And I think that's really interesting too. There are just so many of these. I'm going too much in the weeds here, Kim. I'm sorry. I get very excited. But they're just it's not anonymous, right? There's a continuum in there. The Porters were playing with that continuum. And I think they kind of made decisions by the seat of their pants based on what they thought would be economically advantageous and reputationally advantageous.
There's a real sense of a kind of balance between the two, and these really sort of canny marketing strategies. I mean, they're hustling, I guess, to put it in a very modern way. But it seemed like they're constantly thinking, because they're constantly in debt, how do we make money? So one of the letters that we have on display is from Jane Porter to Henry Colburn, who was a kind of publisher later in her life. And she says, "Thank you very much for sending me this copy of the Naval and Military Gazette," which I raised my eyebrows at and thought that's an interesting read for a woman at this time, which says a lot about me probably. But then she pitches a biographical article to him about an admiral who was executed for treason. So there's this sense that they're doing the novels, but they're also kind of constantly churning out stuff for periodicals as well, and writing in all these different genres, in poetry too. So you said that their early works were kind of badly treated by the critics, but what about the later ones? When they become household names, do they fare a little better?
Yes, and Thaddeus of Warsaw was called by some a work of genius. So it was seen in its day not just as a best-selling phenomenon, but as a critical phenomenon. And you mentioned the Naval and Military Gazette. Jane Porter was publishing on subjects we think of certainly as masculine, on war in very gruesome terms, on statesmen, on generals. I mean, she was heavily invested in this. She said, if she'd been born a man, maybe she should have been a general. So I think her interest in these had to do a lot with her own character and force and authority and what she thought being great meant. She definitely was invested in the great man theory of history, but she could absolutely write, and she knew how to research. So she started researching when her brother was bringing out these panoramic historical paintings that for a while went kind of madly in vogue and made them temporarily rich. She would write the pamphlets that went along with those. And I think those pamphlets were a training ground for Thaddeus of Warsaw, where she brought together all of the kinds of machinery of history writing about battles in bloody, moving, horrific ways, and the kinds of domestic romance. She melded them in ways that people found entertaining, morally upright, which was really important. These were seen as didactic and successfully didactic novels. And historically interesting. They were supposed to make you better people and send you to read more history. That's what these books were supposed to do. And so critics and the public said she did that well. And that lasted for years. It lasted her lifetime, that was seen as something she did well. Initially, she was said to have created a new species and to have done something innovative. But Scott, a dozen years later with Waverley, her reputation as an innovator started to slide. And that's where things shifted up for her, definitely, in terms of what would happen to her posthumously too.
I think it's interesting with Scott because he was so quick to credit Anne Radcliffe for having kind of generated Gothic fiction, and yet this is a slightly different story with his own genre. So I think I'm looking at the time and thinking maybe we'll move on and talk a little bit about their social circles, and then we'll turn it over to everyone else. I mean, you talked about Thaddeus of Warsaw being kind of morally upright. And one of the things that kind of surprised me was the sort of grey areas that are apparent in the book, the social grey areas where, you know, you talk about the Porter sisters associating with Mary Robinson, who was a publicly kind of fallen woman. Like their brother was very anxious about them having a friendship with Robinson and Robinson's daughter. So I wonder if you could say a bit about who else they were kind of mixing with and who they knew at the time.
Yeah, so they had this circle of artists that they knew through their brother, Robert Kerr Porter, but they also had this circle of actors and actresses. And, you know, Robinson had connections to those, although by the time they knew her, she was retired from the stage and largely an invalid. But they became close to the Kemble family, the acting Kemble family. Like they were so incredibly tied in to these interesting London circles. And there's a section where I talk about Jane Porter's interactions with Charles Kemble and Therese de Camp, who became Kemble, I'm sorry. And so, you know, there are these interesting interactions with the stage. Maria was writing an opera for Drury Lane Theatre in the early 1800s. Jane ended up writing also for the stage. They knew actors, but they also had these other friends, these more like Lady de Crespigny was, I guess in American English we would say de Crespigny, but you would probably say de Crespigny, right? So she was an anonymous novelist. She would not have published under her own name, but she loved to take in young writers around her. And so the sisters were part of this very polite circle with her. And they also got to know Elizabeth Benjay, who ran in a salon out of her house. They met many people through Benjay. They hung out with the Joseph Johnston circle. I mean, they knew everyone by a point. They just knew everyone by a point. I was just going over with a Wordsworth scholar. He wanted me to send him a letter where Jane Porter talks about having dinner with Wordsworth and some of the Barbauld circle and the Roscoe circle. And we were going over these incredible lines where Jane Porter says, you know, Wordsworth was the only one who made any sense. Everybody else sounded like a booby. You know, it's just, so they knew everyone, I guess. And now they knew people from the more polite sides of society, and they definitely cultivated royalty. They got to know the famous war hero, Sir Sidney Smith. They cultivated military heroes. The Princess of Wales once came to their modest home. I mean, this is the level they were operating on. But at the same time, they knew poor artists. They knew, you know, actors and actresses with not quite right polite reputations. So they really managed to go across a wide swath of interesting, learned people from this period.
There's a real sense of them being at the hub of so many of these different networks. And in some ways, it would be really good to have some kind of graphic. And I often think this with kind of letter networks, to just connect all of the people together so that you get a kind of clearer picture of the kind of social circles that people moved in. You talked about their love lives at the beginning, and neither married, but were there kind of close calls?
Yes. And you know, the idea that I don't want to do too much plot spoiling, right, Kim? I want people to read the book. But yes, both sisters fell hard, and they often fell for rakes they thought they could reform, like they thought they couldn't fix the bad boys. And naturally, that didn't go very well for them. Nobody will be surprised today to hear that. But there were lots of close calls, and Maria had an unbelievable secret engagement, the story of which sounds like it's right out of a novel, only it's her real life. Jane had a man she fell in love with who ended up becoming involved with a married woman, and that made her life, he drew her into that drama, or she chose to be drawn into that drama. Very difficult story, moving story. Just more kinds of things than we expect, I guess, unless we're talking about Mary Shelley, right? Like everybody knows Mary Shelley made racy choices, but the idea was that she gave up her whole reputation to do it. The Porters kept their polite reputation while they were doing all these things, which I think is also remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly gives the lie to the fact that you have to live this incredibly kind of sterile life in order to maintain a reputation. I think gives a real sense into the ways that women were kind of stretching what was available to them, and stretching the rules. So before we think about their kind of posthumous reputations, I just wanted to linger on one particular moment, and I hope this won't be too much of a plot spoiler. So one of the letters that we have on display in Quills and Characters, and it was the first letter that kind of really jumped out to me from our collections, was written to Jane Porter, and it's by the Margravine of Ansbach, who was formerly known as Elizabeth Craven, which always makes it sound like she's some kind of rock star, I think. It is the most furious letter that we have in our entire collection, I think, and she's probably one of the most formidable women featured in the exhibition. I'm going to read a couple of extracts from this letter, but I wonder, Devoney, if you could kind of set the scene before and tell us what it was that the Porter sisters did that upset the Margravine so very much.
So the Margravine was a quasi-patron to Robert Kerr Porter, and it was that relationship that allowed Maria to get invited in 1809 to become the female companion to the Margravine. And she ended up living there for most of that year and developing feelings for the Margravine's favorite youngest son. And there's so much more I could say, so much more, Kim, but I know, is that enough, do you think, to set up what you want to read? Or do you want me to? Okay.
No, I think that's okay. So yeah, suffice to say that Maria leaves in disgrace, because the Margravine has been reading her letters. So the Margravine follows Maria's departure with this this furious letter, which goes on for absolutely ages, where she writes about herself in the third person.
One thing, let's add this. It's like Catherine Morland getting kicked out of Northanger Abbey, only if Lady Catherine de Bourgh were the one kicking her out. How about that? Does that set it up?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So this letter arrives with Jane Porter. It is with infinite regret the Margravine informs Miss Porter, that's Jane, that she is acquainted with what, had not a providential accident occurred to make it known to the Margravine, might and most probably would have drawn two of the most amiable men in England into a serious quarrel, Sir Robert Porter and Keppel Craven. So this is a kind of duel-worthy event. She goes on to say, there are many things that Miss Maria Porter has written about the Margravine since she has been so well nursed and treated by her, full as devoid of truth, as they attack the Margravine's character as a mother. The Margravine must refute them. Maria has said she believed the Margravine insane, that all her complaint of conduct of her children were only chimeras of her own brain, that Keppel, her élève, whose education, existence, everything he owes to her care and generosity, that she hates everybody that loves him. And then she closes by saying, could not Miss P, and this is Jane, know that a romance in real life must at least have the hero of it in the plot? The Margravine hopes that this will be a warning to the Miss Porters to confine their compositions to novels where only sentiments of gratitude and respect are found in those young ladies. It is somewhat ludicrous to observe, she goes on, the love of one young lady and the credulity of another should transform a sick and cold young man into a sighing lover. And that English lady who will pass to posterity should also be transformed by the Miss Porters into a bad-tempered woman, a cruel mother, and half crazy. So this is really the kind of mother-in-law from hell telling off her, both of these young women, actually. I'd be very interested to know how the letter was received. She says, you know, don't reply to this letter, and then that's kind of the last of it, really, isn't it? I think.
And I'm so glad you read that, Kim. I mean, the Chawton's collection, the Chawton House's collection of that letter particularly transformed the book and is one of the most important letters in the book, to be able to see not only what the sisters had to say about that experience, but to see what the Margravine said to them just made all the difference in my being able to write up that chapter. So I'm so grateful to Chawton for collecting that fabulous letter. It's amazing. I can't wait to come see it again in person in this exhibit.
I mean, I think it's also, this sort of little bit of scandal, I suppose, that happened in this letter. Mariah publishes her 8th novel while she's staying with the Margravine, and I can't remember who it was who reviewed it, but someone sort of said, I'd half expected to find the Margravine and Keppel Craven in the pages, but unfortunately it was a historical novel, so there was nothing about this there. So it was a story that I think maybe was kind of shared, at least in smaller circles. So we've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to ask you a little bit about life after death. So what happened to the Porter sisters, who were so famous in their day after their death? And could you tell us about how their letters survived?
So I think the Porter sisters, like a lot of women writers from this period, were subject to what one scholar, Clifford Siskin, has called the Great Forgetting. That is, there were hundreds of women writers, as we know, those of us who are affiliated with Chawton House know, hundreds of women writers from this era who fell out of literary history. I think what's unusual about the Porter sisters is how far they fell. I mean, they went from great fame to almost total obscurity over the course gradually of 100 years. First, they were relegated, I think, Jane in particular, to children's literature, and her The Scottish Chiefs from 1810, which had been considered one of the great novels of the 19th century. It was a favorite of Queen Victoria, favorite of President Andrew Jackson, praised by Thackeray. It was a great novel, but as it became known as children's literature, I think it stopped being taught in universities. Historical fiction maybe doesn't travel so well across the centuries as novels of manners. So the Porter sisters fell out of the limelight. How did the letters survive? That's interesting. It's because there were no heirs. There were, in fact, only collateral relatives. And through a series of, one could say it was fortuitous or bungling, it ended up that these 3 sea chests full of letters went to auction a couple of years after Jane Porter died in 1852. And I do talk about this. There's a chapter on this at the end of the biography. From there, they ended up in the collection of a notorious manuscript hoarder who was trying to buy every single manuscript known to the earth. And so he had all of these, incredible literary riches, stocked up in like a heroine in a Gothic turret in a Gothic novel, right? Like locked up in the attic. These letters were locked up in the attic until his heirs started selling them off because they didn't want to keep them and wanted the money from them. And the heirs were spending, it was more than a century they spent trying to sell off these letters. Sir Thomas Phillips was the name of that bibliophile or manuscript hoarder or whatever you'd like to call him. But as a result, when Sotheby's started putting pieces up from the Phillips collection to auction, there were not export controls in place in the mid-20th century, and most of them came over to the United States. At that point, however, the Porter sisters were no longer really all that famous or interesting, and there hasn't been somebody who stepped forward to publish a full-length biography. So that's how we got from there to here.
And well, until you. So thank you for the work you've done to kind of shed a light on their lives. You said that you sort of came to Jane Porter because you were writing a book on old age. Could you say a little bit about that and about what sort of happened to her later in her life?
Yes, she tried to make fun. Jane, left without Mariah, tried to make money off of her older productions. And so her books were actually among the first that were republished in the standard novels that Jane Austen's were published in with Colburn and Bentley. Both sisters' novels appeared as early volumes in that collection. And she found other ways to try to republish older writings and make a living off of that. But what she most wanted was a royal pension or a civil list pension. And she advocated for herself and tried desperately to get one of those for years, and it never happened. So I think that is really interesting and crushing. But she was certainly important enough that other people who were getting them were on a similar level of reputation to hers. She did have interesting experiences in later life, but this is a little bit crazy backstory, but I ended up cutting about 400 pages from the biography, long as it is. And most of it is from Jane's late life. And I feel very guilty and not right about that. One of the most interesting things that happened with her is she went with her brother Robert, who P.S. married a Russian princess. How could we not have gotten to that until an hour into this conversation?
There's a whole thing about Robert separately, I think.
Robert and his Russian princess. The sisters called her the Horror because she was a nightmare. But Jane ended up traveling to Russia with her brother and seeing her niece there for the first time in many years, and hanging out, P.S., with a lot of the people who would end up inspiring characters in Tolstoy's War and Peace. So it is like, it's wild, the number of connections that this family had to literary history that we care a great deal about, and how they're part of that, and things that used to be cared about have dropped. But yes, Jane Porter lived long enough to see her fame dwindling, and to struggle. And I think for me, one of the saddest parts is that American publishers had been making a ton of money off of her books. It's estimated that 1 million volumes of her books were sold by 1840 in the United States, from which she saw not a penny because there was no international copyright. She hadn't struck a bargain. But the publishers decided to send her a chair to show their care for her. They sent her a rocking chair. And they didn't have an address for her, so they just sent it care of the Lord Mayor of London. And he got this chair and he's like, I don't know this woman. Like, where should this chair even go? The part that's just crushing is that she didn't have a home to put a chair in. So they sent her this object to honor her when what she could have used was money. And she ended up needing to stow it in other people's homes. She had a peripatetic life where she was going from one rich person's home to another and to her brother's home. So 400 pages of material on that, waiting for anybody who wants it, but apparently not. I think I really wanted to keep the focus on the sisters and their relationship with each other, because to me, that's the beautiful part of this book. And that's the love story at the heart of the book, is the sisters' love for each other.
And I think it says something about the 18th century postal system, the 19th century postal system, that a chair sent to the Lord Mayor of London would work. And also, I mean, there's some quite interesting stuff there around, use the word peripatetic, and the idea of, you know, young women going to stay constantly in other houses, which I think was interesting. So you mentioned an opera libretto. Were the sisters musical at all? And if so, how did music and song influence their writing and play a part in that?
Right. It was said that Mariah could sing as well as Mr. Camp. So that would mean that she was quite a good singer. There are moments, I am sure, where music is part of their fiction in ways that is deep and interesting. But the opera itself, which was called The Fair Fugitives, did not succeed. And that really led Mariah away from writing for the stage. That failure of that play that became an opera and that did not succeed. Lots more that could be said about music. I am definitely not an expert in music. There's a lot here in this archive for people who are looking for projects. Some of the papers have been digitized. Durham has its papers digitized, and New York Public Library has its collection digitized. And if you go to my website, sisternovelist.com, and look under further reading, you'll see links out to those repositories and their digitized letters. But I really hope that there will be a letters edition. Tom McLean at the University of Otago has been proposing one. Fingers crossed that this moves forward. But I think there's a lot here, a lot more that could be said definitely on music. And I'm not the right expert, perhaps, to give more voice to that than's already in the biography.
Do the Porter sisters make frequent reference to Walter Scott in their letters? If I remember correctly, Scott doesn't mention them at all in his letters or his journals.
So there's a lot more Scott drama than I've given you. And there's a short excerpt from the biography that came out in the Smithsonian Magazine that tells some of the story, if you want to go to that. But yes, there are signal references to Scott in the letters. The sisters reunite, or Jane does for sure, with Scott in the 18-teens, just after Waverley is published. And Mariah says, now I hope he's going to repent of the literary sins against you. And by that, I think Mariah means not having publicly credited the Porters with having inspired his work. They weren't dummies. They knew that copying happened and that people were, lifting ideas from each other left and right. But I think they felt especially hurt that this person who'd been their childhood acquaintance couldn't find a place publicly to say a kind word about them in his poems or in his novels, which at that point they didn't for sure know which ones he'd written, right? He was still writing anonymously. And Jane said, eventually the public will hear the true genealogy of these matters. And she did. She waited 15 years, but she first anonymously and then using her own name suggested that she was the one who inspired Scott in the historical novel. It did not go very well for her. And you can read more about that in the book.
Yes, it's a bold move. Does the chair still exist?
I don't believe so. I know so many ridiculous, useless details. I mean, I know their mother's undertaker's name. Like things I don't even have any idea about in my own family. So there is a sketch that exists of what the chair looked like, and so I have some guesses of exactly the style and type it was, but I don't believe most of their possessions were sold also at auction, and even a lot of miniatures from the family, artworks of Robert Kerr Porter's were sold, and portraits of the sisters were sold. These are now very hard to trace. There are some that have resurfaced, but maybe you'll find more. Keep your eyes out.
What was the most difficult aspect of writing this book?
Yeah, so, I do biographical research in the Jane Austen wheelhouse too, and there you find it's like finding a needle in the haystack, right? You've got like some little thing that somebody hasn't noticed before, and it can be a big deal, right? And approaching the Porter project was like facing an entire haystack and saying, what do you even do with this? Like how to give this shape? There's so many kinds of stories I could have told from this material. But I guess the way I would put it is I wanted to think about how the literary marketplace and the marriage marketplace came into conflict and contact for the sisters, and how they were interlayered, interwoven. So those were the things from the haystack that I started to try to pull out. It wasn't easy because the sisters sometimes wrote in code. They would use nicknames for people. And at first when I was reading, I thought, did they really have friends named Agamemnon and Apollo? And of course they didn't. But it took me a while to figure out who's Agamemnon, who's Apollo. It was very interesting. The Margravine, when they would refer to her, they started calling her Pandora, which I just love because, the idea that Pandora is the one who opened a box and let evil into the world. That was how they saw the Margravine in their lives. She'd opened a box and left evil into the world. So forever after, they didn't call her the Margravine, they called her Pandora. So it took me a while to figure out who these people were. There's one point too where the sisters talk about, next time we're going to write something to each other, let's try to use invisible ink. Basically, they say, let's write in lemon juice or milk to try to keep secret what it is we're writing about these beaux. And you'll just hold it up to the fire, and then you can read what I have to say, and our mother and our brothers won't notice it. So it's possible that some of their letters had or have these lemon juice or milk sections in them, but no library in their right mind will let me hold it up to a heat source to check.
Actually, some of the recipe books that we have on display have recipes for all sorts of different types of ink, I think including invisible ink. So it's a thing that people did, and a curse to biographers and letter readers all over the world. Which of the Porter sisters' books would you recommend for reading today?
So again, on sisternovelist.com, under further reading, I have links out to the modern editions of Thaddeus of Warsaw and the Scottish Chiefs. And those are Jane Porter's two best-selling novels. And the modern editions are going to be able to tell you where she is using historical fact, where she is innovating, where she's messing with the truth. If you care about that when you read historical fiction, you're definitely going to want to look at those modern editions. So I would say those two, which not only include war and strife and domestic problems and lots of the kinds of things you would expect from the Outlander series or Poldark or whatever it is that might attract you to historical and masculine based stories from that period. I would say you could start there and read those. But if you want to dip into something by each of the sisters, they co-wrote and co-published some works together in the 1820s. And one is called Coming Out in the Field of 40 Footsteps. And Coming Out is Anna Maria's social novel. It includes her horror princess sister-in-law as a character. It includes a character I'm fairly certain is based on the Margravine von Spock. And it's about just the awful ways that high society exacts a price on young women. The Field of 40 Footsteps is Jane Porter's historical novel about brothers, oral history, dueling, and London. And so you would get a sense of each sister at the height of their powers and how they made these genres work. Right now, I'm working with a team of students on Maria's early stories. So Artless Tales was published by the Juvenilia Press, Juliet McMaster, and now Christine Alexander's press at the University of New South Wales, which has published also a lot of Austen's juvenilia. They published Artless Tales from 1793, and a group of students and I are working on the second volume of Artless Tales from 1795-96. And these stories are, they're immature, right? They were written when she was 15, 16, but I have a soft spot just thinking of the kinds of things she's writing about young people and the struggles they face. They're very, the critics were right. These stories are knowing stories. They talk about sexuality and poverty and just life difficulties that are beyond the years of what a girl that age was supposed to be writing about. So I have a soft spot for those.
Did the sisters retain a strong affection for Edinburgh and Scotland, even if they never returned there?
Absolutely. And I think we can see this in The Scottish Chiefs, Jane Porter's 1810 novel, which is a 5-volume novel. It's long. It's probably the novel of hers that lasted longest. But I hear from readers here in the United States, at least, that if they know Jane Porter, it's because they are of a family of Scottish descent, and they have some ancestry that has made this book be part of their family's book collection. And, in the same way that the Bible was handed down, your 19th century copy of The Scottish Chiefs might be handed down in certain Scottish American families, I've learned. I didn't know that was the case. So yes, I would say that's some evidence. But, I think there continues to be, even though she was born herself in Durham, there continues to be fond feeling toward Jane Porter in some Scottish history and literary circles, and it's certainly because she has fond feeling toward that place in her books. Because The Scottish Chiefs is a William Wallace story, and it's possible that Braveheart, it was in part based on The Scottish Chiefs. Gary Kelly, the scholar, made this claim years ago that he thinks that Jane Porter's was the source text for that particular, for the Braveheart film. I don't know if that's a claim to fame or a claim to shame. There's a scholar named Graham Morton who's been very much working on this question of Porter, Scotland, and the Wallace history. So there's a lot more you could read on that if you wanted to know more. But as late as the 1950s, Jane Porter's version was still in a Classics Illustrated comic book. And there's an illustration of that in the center set of images in the book itself.
Well, we must now all go back and watch Braveheart again, which who needs
or not? I can't. I will not be I'm not sure to recommend or disrecommend. I don't know.
Did any of their stories touch on characters or incidents to do with abolition in the 1790s, or are there any characters of color in their novels?
Yes. So, and they are important to several of their works. I mentioned the subscription list, and they're having abolitionist friends, and the brothers being raised, at least in part, among what were called merchant families in the West Indies. And this, the politics of the Porter sisters seems very much to have been on the side of abolition and progressive politics, but they also took a lot of hospitality and generosity from people who made fortunes from West Indian enslaved people's labor. So I try to be honest in the biography about where that's the case. Given those twin life experiences, it's perhaps not surprising to hear that when these matters come up in their books, they are trying to say things that are more progressive and humanitarian, but they maybe don't get entirely as far as what we would like to see today, or even as far as what some of the works that we return to and learn from, like, for instance, the novel The Woman of Color from 1808 is doing something, I think, that is more progressive and important than what Mariah was doing in The Fair Fugitives. But The Fair Fugitives, her failed comic opera, is actually about rebellion. The Fair Fugitives are both two European women who are trying to escape from men who are trying to force them into marriages and harm them, and about a rebellion of enslaved people. And it's rewritten from a Charlotte Smith novella, Henrietta. So Porter was definitely working in that space. She was very angry that the manager of the theater told her that she needed to take out some of the more political and abolitionist-friendly material from the opera in order to stage it, but she agreed to do it. So these are the kinds of things that we find there, and I do talk about those matters when they come up in the biography for certain.
There are sort of interesting questions around how to present some of that abolition material written by white middle-class women, which does that kind of really disturbing thing of kind of aligning the position of women and the positions of enslaved people. I think it crops up quite a lot. I wanted to finish up by asking about Robert and about his kind of, you talked about his paintings. Can we still see those great historical paintings that he did? And could you say a little bit about his kind of life and his influence on the sisters?
The paintings seem not to have survived. He made an enormous amount off of the first one of these, which was a phenomenon, and then tried to replicate that. And each time he tried to replicate that success, brought himself and his family further into debt. So Robert was the first of them to achieve superstardom, but then he ended up pulling the sisters throughout his life into his financial problems, his personal problems. They loved him dearly. They didn't like their other two brothers very well. And there's lots more that could be said and is said in the book about them. But Robert was their shining star. And I think he deserves to have his own biography told. I think the way that I've told the story probably is not as sympathetic a telling as he might deserve. He ended up doing some important things when he became a Venezuelan diplomat, including working the British slave trade agreement with parts of South America that he was serving as a chargé d'affaires for. He ended up working the abolition of the slave trade agreement from that spot. So he lived everywhere. He traveled everywhere. The sisters mostly didn't travel, but he did it on their dime often and on their pens. And they helped him rewrite his books. It was hard for me to tell his story sympathetically, but he obviously, and their love for him obviously, shaped all of the choices that they made, especially from middle age on.
But I think they emerge out of it as women who take care of themselves when their male relatives fail to do the thing that male relatives are supposed to do, and that the novels tell us that they are supposed to do, but actually in real life didn't do. And it seems like they are constantly trying to pay off debts for their male relatives, which and are extraordinarily good at it, which is a credit to them, but sad that they had to do it in some ways. So
and Mrs. Porter, the sisters were also taking care of their widowed mother. I mean, in some ways not unlike what Jane Austen was living in at the end of her life, except that instead of a brother giving a cottage to his widowed mother and unmarried sisters, the Porter sisters were having to front most of the resources to pay for themselves and their mother. Their mother's quite an amazing character. She's a real heroine for me in the book too. Very plain spoken, uneducated. They would move into these apartments in London and she would say, "This place is a dog hole." and her daughters would say, "Oh, don't say that. We'll make it beautiful. It's not the size of a place. It's the manner of it. We'll make it lovely." And she's like, "No, it's a dog hole." I quite love Mrs. Porter.
But she also seems to give them enough freedom to make of their lives what they do, and you know, neither one of them kind of disgraces her. I think she properly teaches them independence in a way that's
absolutely, for the period she was very, very permissive, but it's clear that she was in a fun-loving way, not in a neglectful way.
Indeed. So I think that seems like a lovely place to leave it with an excellent Mrs. Porter. So I would encourage anyone who hasn't read the book to buy it and read it and enjoy every second of it. And Devoney, thank you so very, very much for giving up your time to talk to us about these two sisters. I will point you to Devoney's website as well, where you can look at those resources on the extra reading part of it, so you can go off and read the Porter sisters too, and share their stories. So I hope that I'll see many of you back again at the next event. But for now, I shall wish you all a very good evening and just say thank you again to Devoney.
Thank you so much. So great to see you.